next up is Kerry, and Kerry leverages current exploratory psychology research program.
Cool, so I'm going to be talking about bottlenecks to studying the mind introspectively, and in particular the need for better instruments for introspection. Specifically, I'm going to discuss kind of the history of attempts to take an introspective approach to understanding psychology, why those attempts failed, and what to do about it. So the outline for the presentation is, first I'm going to talk about why you might want to study the mind introspectively. Then I'm going to cover some of the history of the attempts to do this. I'll talk about what bottlenecks those attempts face, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at Leverage Research that's intended to address some of these bottlenecks. Okay, so first, why might you want to study the mind introspectively? I think introspection has a number of kind of obvious benefits, and I think it's a little unsurprising that at the kind of dawn of experimental psychology, introspection was a much more common approach, especially kind of introspection-focused approaches much more common than they are today. One benefit is cost. You have a mind, you can look at your mind, that's not expensive to do. There's cost in terms of like training people in introspection methodologies, but it's pretty low cost. You have kind of direct access to an important object of study. So to the degree that you think your mind is important to understanding people, you can kind of look at your mind in some kind of direct way, which is useful. And then third, there's this idea of privileged access. So this is an idea that goes back to Descartes. And the core idea is that certain kinds of introspective knowledge can be known with high certainty by you, even though it can't be known that that's true of you by other people. So specifically, the moment-to-moment experience of your mind can be known with some high degree of certainty by you. And so if you're familiar with your history of philosophy, Descartes has this cogito, this idea of I think, therefore I am. That's what this idea is referencing. There are also a number of obvious challenges to trying to study the mind introspectively. One is an idea that goes back at least as far as David Hume, which is that introspecting on a mental state tends to change it. So if you have some mental state and you introspect on it, the new mental state is the looking at it plus the state, which is a slightly different state than the original thing. And so the looking at your mind tends to cause your mind to do different things than if you're not trying to look at it. Additionally, not all mental content is available to kind of naive introspection. So it's common observation that people don't understand themselves as well as one might hope. People are often confused about their motivations, they don't understand why they do things the way they do. And that's going to be because there's some mental content that's hidden. So when you look at why am I doing things, not all of that content is immediately available to you. So that's one challenge to trying to study the mind introspectively. And then third, you want to take into account that your mind may work differently than other people's minds. So if you discover a bunch of patterns in your own mind, you want to make sure that that generalizes, that those are patterns that are true for other people and not just patterns that happen to be true of you. Okay, so that's the basic kind of why you might want to study the mind introspectively. Now I'm going to discuss the history of attempts to actually do this. And there's some caveats. So I used to run Leverage's History of Science research program where we did super in-depth case studies into things like this, like discoveries in the history of science. This is not at that level of depth, so I might read more original research and more of the history here and come to different views, but this is kind of my current view based on the reading I've done kind of so far. First, though, I want to address a kind of narrative that the field of psychology has about itself. I've heard this referred to as kind of the textbook narrative of psychology. I did undergraduate work in psychology. This is what they told me. That's how the field progressed. And that narrative is, first, psychology began as the study of the mind based almost exclusively on the method of introspection. So this was like at the kind of dawn of experimental psychology in the late 1800s. Second, people learned that actually introspection is really unreliable, and that doesn't work. And so behaviorism arises, and they decide to study behavior, which is more objective, and so they can do more objective experimentation. And then finally, people realize, oh, actually behaviorism is really limited. Studying just behavior doesn't quite work. So they go back to studying the mind, but they have these more rigorous experimental and statistical methods. And as far as I can tell, every part of that is either wrong or seriously overstated. I've done less research into the transition from behaviorism to cognitive psychology, but just in terms of from 1 to 2. So from the idea that psychology used to be based on introspection and then it was based on behaviorism. There's a number of problems with that kind of basic account. So one, it's just not true that psychology was based exclusively or overwhelmingly on introspection. It is true that in the past, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were more attempts to use introspection-based methods to understand the mind, but there was lots of other work going on in psychology that wasn't based primarily on introspection. These were like schools of thought or approaches that were more popular, but the field was diverse and has kind of always been fairly diverse. Second, the idea that introspection was overthrown by behaviorism is seriously overstated. The actual history here is the behaviorists, especially Watson, wrote a lot of polemics about how bad everybody else in the field was, and they talked a lot of shit about everybody else. And that kind of found its way into the history, even though those polemics were not as grounded to the actual facts of the situation as one might have liked. And so it is true that some of these schools fell by the wayside over time, but it's not that behaviorism killed them or anything like that. We'll kind of discuss some of the reasons that those schools of thought didn't last longer. Third, introspection never really went away. So we'll discuss this more later, but there's plenty of introspection-based approaches that are used in psychology now. They're just not focused primarily on introspection. They use introspection as an additional tool with other tools that they use. And then finally, there's this kind of idea that reliability was the primary problem, and that's why that's why introspection didn't work as an approach. And I think we'll discuss that. I think reliability isn't a serious issue here. Okay, so what were the actual attempts? So I'm going to discuss kind of three. There have been a bunch of attempts to study the mind introspectively. I'm going to discuss three to give you kind of a flavor and discuss kind of why those succeeded or why they failed. So the first is psychophysics, which is a research program in the 1860s. It was founded by Gustav Theodor Fexner in 1860. And he was concerned with discovering the relationship between physical stimuli and internal experience. So they have this kind of famous research protocol of just noticeable differences, which is kind of gives you a flavor for what they were trying to do. So here they'll show you two stimuli. So maybe it's like a line segment and another line segment, or two colors that look almost the same but you're not sure, or different brightnesses. And then the thing they ask is, are these the same or are they different? And so sometimes they'll show you two stimuli that are in fact the same, sometimes they'll be different. And the thing they were studying is how much of a change in the stimuli is required before you notice that they're different in conscious experience. And they developed some laws that describe kind of how much of a change is required before people notice it. And that was kind of the basic of their approach. Psychophysics as a research tradition continues today. There's an annual psychophysics research conference that happens every year. And so it was like a moderately successful continuing research program. The main problem is that it's pretty limited in scope. So if you're trying to understand how people work, this is an aspect of how people work, but it doesn't seem like it's the most important, largest aspect. It doesn't seem like this is going to cover something very broad in the field of psychology. So it kind of succeeded at its narrow range, but the range was narrow. Next we have structuralism, which was developed initially by Wilhelm Wundt and later kind of expanded on by his student Edward Titchener in the 1890s. And this was an attempt to break down complex thought into more basic sensory components. So it's easiest to understand this by analogy to chemistry. In chemistry, you might take some simple substance like water, and it turns out that that can be decomposed into oxygen and hydrogen. And the idea in structuralism is we're going to take all thoughts, even ones that appear to be fairly simple, and break them down into the most basic elementary components. And as Titchener describes it, the basic approach was to take some complex thought and then break it down over and over again until you could describe it in terms of very, very basic mental components that resisted any further breakdown. He also described the goal as creating a kind of periodic table of basic elements of thought. So you have all these like here are the all complex thoughts would reduce to some small number of individual like mental moves. One thing that's important about structuralism is it required really extensive training in order to be able to engage in research in structuralism. So there's some reports that they required people to have 10,000 introspections. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but it sounds like a large number, and all the descriptions suggest it required a lot of training before they'd even admit your data into their experiments. And so they had a very elaborate method that required quite a lot of training in order to be able to participate. And part of why the training was so elaborate is that you had to really strip out all of your common sense concepts and notions in order to be able to attend to basic sensations. So if they show you like my shirt and they say, what do you see? You say, I don't know, blue and white striped shirt. That's just totally wrong on their method. So you can describe the sensation of blueness and of whiteness, and you can describe some sensations that are giving you the concept of shirt, but the like basic concepts that apply to that object, that's not part of their approach. So you're really kind of unlearning a bunch of how you basically think about and react to stimuli in order to be able to participate in this kind of introspective approach. And then structuralism ultimately died out after Titchener's death in 1927. So why did structuralism fail? There's a few things that are relevant here. One is Titchener rejected the need for practical applications from his research, and that limited his access to funding. His argument, which for what it's worth, I'm not sure he was wrong, but his argument was psychology's not there yet, where we're going to have practical applications. We're doing more basic research, kind of basic science. I'm not going to promise behavioral outcomes as part of the research. The problem though is, like in the US, for example, funding for psychology depended heavily on advertisers, educational administrators, the military, law enforcement, and other institutions, and they wanted behavioral outcomes. And so his approach here kind of limited his access to funding. Second, the extensive training limited the pool of researchers available. So the higher the cost is to getting involved, the less researchers are going to get involved. That's not alone a deal breaker for building kind of a field, but in addition to requiring quite high costs to learn the introspective approach, the experimental results were hard to understand and hard to interpret if you didn't have this kind of training. So if they're like, all the thoughts break down into these components, if you don't understand their introspective method, it's hard to see intuitively why they're right, why that's exciting. And so that meant there was a barrier to entry in both appreciating the research and wanting to get involved and in actually getting involved. And that limits your access to further disciples who are going to learn your research approach. And then finally, Titchener's ontology was probably mistaken. This, as it turns out, is not as big a deal as you think. Plenty of researchers develop really good research programs while having a basic understanding that's mistaken. But in Titchener's case, the kind of enthusiasm behind his research program got stolen by people who pointed out some of these basic problems. So in particular, Titchener thought all thoughts were going to be able to be broken down, and they're going to be broken down into sensory components. And the Gestalt psychologists argued that not all thoughts can actually be broken down, and then the other schools that we'll talk about here in a second argued that it couldn't be broken down into sensory components. That some thoughts were imageless or didn't have any sensory element at all. So that kind of showed that his basic ontology that underlied his research program was probably wrong. So next approach I want to talk about is the Wurzburg School, which was founded in Wurzburg, Germany in 1903. And they were concerned with investigating kind of higher cognitive functions than the structuralists. And they used an introspective approach called retrospection. So they would give you a prompt stimuli. So maybe it's, they have different methods, but one would be, maybe they give you a simple math problem, 2 + 2, or they give you a word and there's a response word you're supposed to come up with. And so they ask you to, they give you the stimulus, you give a response. And then immediately after doing that, you recount everything that happened in your mind in between getting the stimulus and giving the response. And so this was their approach to kind of understand what's happening when you're doing relatively basic problem solving. This approach also required training, but it was nowhere near as extensive as the structuralist approach. So they didn't let kind of people off the street participate in their research, but they could train you in this approach without too much difficulty. And this approach also largely died out when the founders died out, which is a kind of common theme throughout the history. The Wurzburg School has a more complicated legacy, so I don't want to say that it failed exactly, but I also don't want to say that it succeeded. On the positive side, it's credited with discovering the idea of imageless thoughts. So there's this big controversy with the structuralists about whether all thoughts were going to be sensory. Their introspective method showed that a bunch of people reported thoughts that have no obvious sensory component, and so that was an important discovery. And then it has some modern antecedents. There's a protocol called the Think Out Loud protocol, where you just kind of articulate your thoughts as you're having it. It has clear antecedents to some of the work by the Wurzburg School. And then kind of on the negative side, the Wurzburg School failed to direct the attention of the subjects to anything in particular in the thought processes. So you can think of it as kind of a naturalistic approach. They just want to observe what's happening in your mind. And that limited the kind of depth that they could go into and what they could learn. And more generally, I think they kind of never advanced beyond stamp collecting. So what I mean by that is they can observe a bunch of thoughts, they can even categorize them, they can be like, there's 5 kinds of thoughts and here's how they work. But they didn't have the ability to intervene on them, to change them, to probe deeper. And so this kind of limited the practical applications to the research. Okay, so that's the history of attempts. So now I want to discuss, given that, what are the bottlenecks to studying the mind introspectively? And I think there are basically two. So one, there's this mistaken narrative in psychology that I've already discussed a little bit, that I'll discuss more. And two, I think there's a need for better instruments. What I mean by instruments here is introspective protocols, like approaches to directing people and how to look at their minds. And for what it's worth, my understanding of the relationship between these two is if the instruments were better, and obviously better, the mistaken narrative wouldn't be a problem. People would just forget that they used to think introspection was debunked. But while the instruments aren't good enough, there's not a lot of effort going into making them better because of the mistaken narrative. So first, on the mistaken narrative, so I think there's a bunch of misinformation in the field of psychology about this. I think it's, so I talked about this a bit earlier, but introspection wasn't rejected, I think, for being too unreliable, even though that's a common part of the story in the field of psychology. So the usual thing that they point to is that researchers would introspect on things and get different results. They'd end up disagreeing with each other. But of course, scientists disagreeing with each other is really common. That's not a problem for your field necessarily. And the concerns about reliability were well known to the people developing these protocols and doing this work. And so they did a lot of work to standardize their approaches and so on. And so I think this just wasn't a serious problem in the way that it's sometimes assumed. Second, in addition, introspection is in fact widely used today. So introspection is used in fMRI studies when they're trying to correlate like mental activity to particular brain imaging. It's used implicitly as part of self-report surveys, which is super common methodology in psychology. It's also widely used in clinical psychology, including in things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So in addition, introspection didn't actually go away. But despite this, the kind of narrative that introspection as a primary approach to studying the mind got debunked limits further effort going into developing better tools. And then the other bottleneck is the need for better instruments. So as I noted at the beginning of the presentation, naive introspection, so introspection where you just look at the mind in whatever way makes sense to you, has a number of limitations. So first, not all mental content can be easily uncovered by introspection. You need to know where to direct your attention, and you need to find patterns that are applicable to others as well as yourself. And I think the kind of various schools of psychology are defined by having different approaches to solving those problems and developing different instruments that then gave them different results. But I think they all also failed because the different instruments they had all had serious limitations. So the ideal instrument that you would need to do this well would need to kind of fill a number of criteria. It would ideally be cheap. It would be relatively easy to use. You wouldn't be able to find novel, repeatable patterns. You wanted to open up a broad domain of unanswered questions, and you wanted to have plausible practical applications. And then if you look at the past approaches, they all kind of fail one of these. So structuralism wasn't easy to use and didn't have practical applications. The Wurzburg school didn't find particularly novel patterns because they just had a kind of naturalistic approach and didn't develop into practical uses. And then psychophysics actually does the best on these, except the field of inquiry that they opened up was pretty narrow, so it wasn't very broad. And so it didn't expand further for that reason. So as you might expect, since I'm working on introspective psychology, and I think this is the bottleneck, some of the work I'm doing, I think, is intended to address some of these bottlenecks, so I thought I'd talk briefly about some of that work. The main way that I think about my work is as kind of open sourcing tools for introspection. So from 2012 to 2019, a bunch of researchers at Leverage had a kind of loose research collaboration looking into a number of areas, including psychology. And some of that work involved developing instruments for introspection. And so some of the instruments I think are pretty good. They're certainly worth releasing. And so the work that I'm doing is like refining those and then releasing them to get other researchers to see what they find when they use those tools to look at their minds. One tool that we have is belief reporting, which is a tool for eliciting mental content. I'm not going to describe how to do belief reporting here, but if you want to grab me, I'm happy to talk about it. The basic of the tool is you adopt a particular intention, which is to do something like tell the truth or give voice to reality, and then you make statements and see whether they are consistent or inconsistent with that intention. And we find that statements that are consistent with that intention have a bunch of interesting properties. So they tend to be more psychologically resonant than statements that don't, that are consistent with that intention, by which I mean, if you interact with them, you get more interesting kind of psychological effects. And they have like interesting feelings of being true. They have some interesting properties. Additionally, sometimes the statements that are consistent with that intention will be different than the statements that you think of as all things considered true. We think that this may indicate that belief reports get at something like your underlying beliefs. But anyways, I can talk more about belief reporting if you're interested. And then we also have a set of techniques for organizing belief reports, which is called charting. So this organizes the content of belief reports, shows how different pieces of mental content are related to one another, and then helps guide further exploration. It helps you decide what to belief report on next. So for example, here's an example of a chart that you build in charting. The arrows here are relationships between belief reports, and then the colors represent patterns that the person who constructed the chart thinks that those belief reports fall into. And so charting has a bunch of sub-skills involved in it, which I'm going to work on refining and releasing. And then ultimately the hope is that you can have other people building charts and using belief reporting to introspect and see what they learn about their minds. More generally, we're hoping to build a kind of external community of researchers who are interested in the project of building instruments for exploring the mind introspectively, and in using some of the instruments we've already developed to do that. And so I think that's the current bottleneck, and that's what we're working on. Thanks.